After the Giovanni engineered the fall of the Cappadocians, or so they thought, the up-and-coming Camarilla expressed concerns about the so-called Devil Clan. The purge of the Cappadocians entered full force soon after the Anarch Revolt, and the Kindred of the Camarilla were worried that this was more of the same. With the upstart Anarchs forming into what would become the Sabbat, the Camarilla wouldn't afford a war on yet another front. So Augustus Giovanni and the Inner Council of the Camarilla met in Venice in 1528 and signed an agreement. The problem is, no one really knows what's in the agreement. For years, all that was known was that the Giovanni had some degree of autonomy in the Camarilla domains, and that the clan was given ownership of the city of Venice in exchange for the inner circle being allowed to hold their meetings there. After the family reunion, however, an additional detail has been revealed. The promise has a limit of 500 years, meaning it will expire in 2028. Both the Camarilla and the Hecata are scrambling to find out the details of the arrangement, as well as the consequences once it expires. Greetings, Kindred. I am Voivode Maquette, and welcome to another episode of Metaplot Monday. And today we're going over the Loresheet, The Promise of 1528. Now, if you follow Thicker Than Water, I'm sure you've noticed a trend that most of the time when the Hecata comes up, the Promise of 1528 comes up as a threat of some kind, or as some looming plot line in the distance. Now, we are in 2023 right now, which means there's only like 5 years left of this promise. This is a quickly expiring lore sheet, but it's something that is really interesting because before V5, there was never any thought that there was an expiration to this. This was just the separation of church and state, effectively, when it came to the idea of the Giovanni and the Camarilla. Now, one of the details that comes up in my game quite often is the Giovanni made this promise. Does it still apply to the Hecata? Well, apparently to the Camarilla, yes, it still does, because most of them still see the Hecata as the Giovanni, and they're not really worried about anything else. The idea is to just stay out of each other's way for 500 years, apparently. But there are some details, and hopefully over time we might actually get to see it. Maybe, perhaps, in 2028, we're going to get an update that talks about what happens. Who knows? Maybe the Hecata will join the Camarilla, or the Hecata will join the Anarchs, or there's just going to be a whole new war that we're going to have to worry about. It's just building plotline and anticipation. So let's go ahead and take a look into this and see exactly what it is that this lore sheet gives to people who decide to take it. Investing one trait into this lore sheet gets you Legal Scholar. You're an active student of the promise. You don't know much, but that's more than most Kindred know. Even the fact that you know such a document exists gives you leverage. In legal disputes with Camarilla Kindred or members of the Hecata, you gain 2 dice on persuasion rolls. Now, this is kind of interesting because there's nothing on here that says that you have to be a specific clan to take this lore sheet. So utilizing this in an argument between Camarilla or between Hecata doesn't actually have anything to do with whether or not you yourself are Camarilla or Hecata. You could be an Hecata using this against the Camarilla or other Hecata. You could be a Camarilla using this against the Hecata or other Camarilla. It's going to be massively situational. Investing 2 traits into this lore sheet gets you Scrap of Information. You saw a scrap of a transcript of the promise once. A lot of forgeries have circulated among the Kindred over the centuries, but you're reasonably sure this one is genuine. This makes you a hot commodity among other Kindred who hunger to know what's in the promise. Once per story, if you allow Kindred access to your notes on the promise fragments for research, you gain a temporary dot in contacts, heard, influence, or resources for the remainder of the story, and may call in a major boon from the vampire in the future. So this is cool. This just says that you have notes on a legit fragment, or at least what you consider a legit fragment of the promise, and it discusses what payment you are taking so that other people can see it. A major boon is one of them, so that tells you how important this is. But a major boon and a temporary dot in either contacts, heard, influence, or resources. That's pretty cool. That is really neat, and it can up things significantly. I'm a huge fan of backgrounds, so that's why I like this one. Investing 3 traits into this lore sheet gives you tick tock. You know, or believe you know, the consequences of allowing the promise to expire. And they aren't good. Once per story, you can give advice to members of your local faction, the Camarilla Court, if you are Camarilla Kindred, or the local family, if you're Hecata, and expect to be taken seriously. You will get an audience and 2 automatic successes on any roll which leverage your knowledge during the meeting. So this kind of shows that there are constant discussions happening over this, because there are a lot of Hecata out there. There are a lot of Camarilla out there. I think the Anarchs should really be involved in this as well. I know it's not mentioned here, but I do believe that they should count also. But the idea of who's going to go where, how things are going to work, and what happens when the time expires is a hot topic for debate. And you are going to have not only the ability to gain access to those discussions, but also be 2 traits up in conversation concerning those things. That's pretty significant when it comes to the idea of an entire sect and their interactions with the entire world. Investing 4 traits into this lore sheet gets you faulty memory. You read the promise once, but for some reason you can never recall the text in full. Even if you have advantages or powers that would normally allow you to remember things or uncovered buried memories, but once in a while, snippets surface to help you at just the right time. Once per story, you can add 3 dice to an appropriate roll where memory of the promise would help you. Obviously, there are going to be situations where people cross into the wrong territory, or there's a deal that needs to be struck, and this is the kind of thing that's going to come in handy. It really kind of puts into consideration who exactly wrote these things up. Augustus Giovanni and the elder members of the Camarilla's Inner Council. Stop and think about that. How many of those people have dominate? A good number of them. And there's a good way of basically saying that maybe there's a dominate power that the elders have, that they're able to put it on documents. Now, this is all speculation. It has nothing to do with anything. But imagine if an elder wrote up a contract and made it so that anybody who actually looked at the contract couldn't remember it. That's kind of awkward, but also you could get a signature on that thing and then screw somebody over, which kind of feels that way about the promise when you stop to think about where it could be going. Now, the idea that, like, in times of duress and stress, once per story, you might be able to actually recall something that can help you, is also something that kind of, like, goes along with the dominate, because sometimes in traumatic situations, you can break through dominate. So, anyway, I guess all I really have is speculation for faulty memory, but that's what I have to say about it. Investing 5 traits into this lore sheet gets you Signatory. You are directly related to one of the signatories of the promise, or you are a signatory yourself. Once per chronicle, you can leverage your knowledge of the promise to force a Camarilla prince or a Hecata Anziani to permanently change a ruling or local law in your favor, using your knowledge of the promise to give you political clout. However, you must decide why you are unable to ever speak of the details of the promise. Perhaps it's a thaumaturgical compulsion, the spirit of a loved one threatened with eternal torment, or a lot of Ventrue dominate. I'm going to go ahead and say that this one just kind of backed up what I just said about number 4. But it's actually kind of interesting because this is one of the few lore sheets that actually talks about you possibly being an elder who was around 500 years ago. This right here, this right here, mistakenly from World of Darkness most likely allows people to play 500-year-old characters, but most likely on the Hecata side because they don't suffer from the beckoning. I don't know. There's a lot of ways you can say this, and obviously age limitations are up to the game itself and not to what World of Darkness or anything else has to say. But just stop and think about it. It does say that you might be one of the signatories, which means you signed the promise, which means yo ass was there in 1528 when it was signed. Or maybe they do amendments every once in a while. Who knows what the Camarilla and the Anziani are up to behind closed doors, correct? After all, the Camarilla do have permission to meet in Venice whenever they need to, thanks to the agreement itself. Anyway, I'm very interested to know what your thought is in the promise of 1528, because although it does not really affect the game very much, at least on our end, it is something that keeps coming up and looming in the distance. And there really is, right now, in February of 2023, or I guess this is probably going to come out in March, there's only 5 years left of this damn thing, and there's no telling where the plot line's going to go. So please give me your thoughts. I would like your 2 cents on the thought process of this whole thing. I am Voivode Maquette, and this is Our World of Darkness, and thank you for joining me for another deep dive into a lore sheet on Metaplot Monday. Good evening.